Good evening, everybody. If you will, take your Bibles and turn to Psalm 77. Appreciate Michael reading that for us. Lately, my heart has been really heavy, really filled with questions and heartache and pain. That's something that happened just a few weeks ago here in our community that we haven't talked about collectively. How can 3 children and 3 adults be senselessly murdered in broad daylight, just miles down the road from where we're sitting tonight at the Covenant School? That was the 19th shooting at a school or university in 2023. There's other pains and other questions. I had a chance this week to spend time with a friend of mine who is the widow of another friend of mine. And I don't know why John Banks died at 30 years old. Somebody who loved God so much and loved his family and had so much life left to live ahead of him, and instead suffered with a lot of pain and left behind a child without a father and a wife without a husband. Natural disasters come and wipe out communities and homes and lives, and miscarriages happen. And marriages break, and loneliness overwhelms people, and the exhaustion of battling with temptations and sin and disappointment at the way our life has turned out, or confusion at not understanding God's plan and his timing, can feel like a lot. The circumstances of life raise difficult questions regarding the seeming absence of God's presence and the silence and mystery of his purposes that sound a lot like, why do bad things happen? Or if God is so good and he's so pure and he's so powerful, then why do these things happen? Or how do these things happen? If he was really that good and that pure and that powerful, would these things still happen? And ultimately, those questions boil down to, where are you, God? And if you love me, why is this happening? And those types of questions are at the heart of Psalm 22, verse 1, which reads, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? This tension, this conflict between what the Bible says about God and what we know to be true about God, but with the brokenness that we experience everywhere else around us in the world, it creates a messy and nebulous gray area. This tension, this gray area, is actually all through the scriptures. There's a special word for it. It's called lament. Lament is the honest cry of a hurting heart wrestling with the paradox of pain and the promises of God's goodness. Or in other words, how do we reconcile the fact that there's brokenness in the world and we have all these promises that we know to be true about God's goodness and his character, but sometimes our lived experiences make it feel like that's not true? Lamenting is the act of expressing our sorrow, grief, and mourning to God. It's a form of prayer that allows us to be really honest with God about our struggles and our pain. And it's not just about expressing sadness, but it's also about seeking comfort and hope and healing in God. A third of the Psalms are lament. We see lament scattered throughout the book of Jeremiah, all throughout Job. We even have a book that's titled Lamentations. It's the book of laments. And at the beginning of the book of laments, we see this conflict and this tension positioned. How the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. Or in other words, God, it feels like you are really angry with the nation. It feels like we are in darkness and there's a cloud everywhere and we don't have a lot of hope in this current situation. It's really bleak. But then later, just a chapter over, how can it be true that the writer then writes, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. So we have what would appear to be a contradiction, that it feels really dark and really hopeless over here, God, but also we know to be true that your mercies never come to an end and your love never ceases. These questions of why and how are scattered throughout the Bible. And that is way smaller than I anticipated it being on the screen. Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go to mourning because of the oppression of my enemy? O Lord, God of hosts, how long will you be angry with your people's prayers? For you are the God in whom I take refuge. Why have you rejected me? Do you see these why and these how questions? God, you feel like you're far away from me. God, have you forgotten me? How long are you going to be angry with your people? And you're who I go to for refuge. Why does it feel like you've rejected me? Those circumstances that we talked about earlier, in moments of tragedy and pain and grief, it is very natural of the human experience to sometimes ask these types of questions. And there's a whole lot more. Will you forget me forever? My eyes fail from weeping. My heart is poured out on the ground. I'm weary with moaning. My eyes waste away because of grief. Why did I even ever come out of the womb to see this? I'm in anguish. My sighing is like daily bread. My groanings are like water. Horror has overwhelmed me. And things like I wish that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. Have you ever felt this way? I know I have. The prevalence of these types of emotions and prayers and feelings in Scripture, combined with our lived experiences and truth of these human emotions, just hammer home the importance of lament. So, okay, yeah, lamenting's important. You just showed me like 25 verses on why that's important. But if it's so important, why do we sometimes struggle to pray and talk and think like this? I think sometimes there's a fear of appearing weak. It's easy for us to want to look like we've got it all put together and to be really honest and really vulnerable with our doubts and our hurts and our pains is a scary and intimidating thing to come before God with them and to come before other people. But I think also there's maybe a lack of understanding that prevents us from lamenting how we should sometimes, maybe couched within the question of like, is this even a thing we're allowed to do? Barry was talking a little bit this morning about how the people were grumbling against Jesus, and you've got to be careful not to complain. And so I think we have to put it within the right context of, well, how are these people being so honest and vulnerable with God? And how do we lament properly, not wallowing in self-pity or blaming God for our problems, but instead with a humble and sincere heart? How do we draw near to the Lord, who in Psalm 34 we read, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." He invites us to come to him, but sometimes a lack of familiarity or a lack of understanding about how to do it can prevent us from processing the pain that is very real and present in our lives. I think sometimes lament can also feel like maybe the opposite of praise, because it asks difficult questions and it wrestles deeply. But lament isn't the opposite of praise. It's actually a path to get to praise, and we'll discover that in Psalm 77 when we examine that in just a moment. But also to lament, to bring these complaints and these questions before the Lord, is not to be faithless. Instead, as you're going to see, to do this properly is actually an act of faith. To have questions, to have doubts, to have hurts, and to say, despite those and even through those, I'm still going to come to God, that requires faith. Sometimes there's some cultural or expectations within a group of people where it's like, hey, we haven't really historically done this corporately, or I don't want to be overly emotional, or for whatever reason, sometimes that can hold us back, or perhaps it's guilt or shame at sins in your own life, at shortcomings, things that have led you to feel so far away from God. Or perhaps the one that's the most personally relevant for me, unresolved trauma. Are there things in your life that you have dealt with by just not dealing with them? Things that would be too painful to really consider the depths of your own sin, too painful to consider the things that have happened in your life, that to take them before the Lord honestly and ask for help, it just hurts too much, and so we don't. But even though we may struggle with it, here's why we need it. Lament is how we bring our sorrow to God. Without it, we won't know how to process our pain. And silence, bitterness, and anger can dominate our spiritual lives instead. Without a proper understanding of lament, we won't know how to help people walking through sorrow. Instead, the best we can offer are trite solutions, unhelpful comments, or maybe impatient responses. What's more, without lament, we're going to miss the historic lessons that lament scattered all through the Bible is meant to teach us. So the aim of our lesson is to help you discover the grace of lament, to encourage you to embrace it when the circumstances of your own life feel like they're under a dark cloud. Every lament is really a prayer. It is the cry of a hurting, confused, pain-filled yet believing heart. It's an act of faith where we resist the temptation to stop talking to God because we're angry or disenchanted with Him. Laments express to God what He already knows about our hearts. To cry in moments of anguish and pain is an inherently human response. To lament in moments of anguish and pain is a uniquely Christian response. So let's look at Psalm 77. Within Psalm 77 and within the context of laments within the Bible, there's a framework of an address to God, a complaint, a request, and then an expression of trust and or praise. So keep an eye out as we go through Psalm 77 here. Look at this structure, because this structure is helpful at not only helping us understand what we're going to study, but it's pivotal if we're going to actually be able to implement this in our own lives, in our own struggles. So Psalm 77 is written by a guy named Asaph. We don't know a ton about Asaph. He's mentioned a couple times earlier in the Bible as someone who's going to lead the congregation in worship, as priestly service. He was appointed by David to do that and to sing at the dedication of the temple. And there's actually like a pretty big smattering of psalms that are from Asaph. So it's not just this one thing. But within this section, we don't actually have a ton of context as to what the affliction is here. There's other psalms where there's like specific mentions of a foe or an enemy, or of like, I can understand now, Asaph, why you're writing about this. We don't have that in this psalm. So as a result, it actually can zoom out and become more applicable because it's not pigeonholed into one specific thing. It's also important to notice that this psalm is personal and simultaneously it's communal. Asaph is speaking about his personal struggle and his personal questions, but he's also doing this on behalf of a larger group of people. He pours out his heart in painful prayer while anchoring his heart to God's faithfulness in the past, and he prays in pain while remembering the past. So with that as kind of a context for what's lament, why it's important, why do we sometimes struggle with it, let's read into Psalm 77. So at the beginning here, it starts off with, I cry aloud to God. And then Asaph repeats himself for emphasis. He says aloud to God, and it's done intentionally to frame the tone of this text. He's in pain and he is not silent. However, he's not just talking or complaining or crying. He's crying out in prayer aloud to God. Look at these other references to prayer in the first couple verses. He will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying, which is a reference to a prayer posture of coming before the Lord with open hands. So clearly, Asaph is reaching out in the middle of his pain, and we can see that he is struggling. And there's more on that in just a minute, but what I want you to see from the outset relates earlier to what I was talking about lament being inherently a prayer. It takes faith to pray in the middle of your pain. To lament, even with its messy struggle and tough questions, is an act of faith. So let's establish that right up front. Prayerful lament, even with tension and challenges, is better than remaining silent. There's still hope in a lament, even if it doesn't resolve quickly. A lot of people are afraid of lament, but there's something that's actually significantly worse than lament, and that's silent despair. And this is a little counterintuitive, but lament and despair are actually like complete polar opposites. Silent despair on one end is basically a manifestation of unbelief. It's a denial that God exists, while lament is a costly and sincere demonstration of belief in God. Think of it like this through the analogy of like a married couple who's having problems. If you had a couple who's in a relationship and they were not talking to each other whatsoever, I think we would all be able to realize that that is in a pretty bad way. If they're not even talking to each other, they're not even trying to resolve things, we wouldn't have much of a life expectancy left on that relationship. And so it's a little counterintuitive, but you would say, hey, even a couple that is like fighting and going at it, and it's a little messy and they're wrestling with some stuff, if they're at least talking, that is an improvement, and that is better, and there is a significantly higher chance of reconciliation and relationship there than the couple who's not talking to each other. And that's the exact same thing with our relationship with God. Think about it in the terms of your own life. If you've ever stopped praying to God for any meaningful period, your relationship with Him falls off of a cliff. It's in the moments that we can lament, we can struggle, we can have doubts and questions and frustrations with the Lord and take them to Him, that even though it's difficult, it's infinitely better than giving God the silent treatment. So look a little further in verses 2 through 4. We see the emotional struggle. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan, I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I can't speak. So yeah, Asaph is praying, but his praying is not bringing comfort or encouragement or rest or resolution. His prayers are not working in that sense. Yet he still is praying. Lament does lead us to resolution, but it is not always a resolution that is quick or timely. Grief is not tame, and when we're dealing with real issues and struggles, lament is not just like some linear equation of, man, I'm really sorry, God, like I'm hurting a lot, can you just take this away from me, and boom, instantly it's resolved. Lament is where you go when you're in pain with the faith-filled belief that one day God's going to make it right. Lament is where you live, or better yet, maybe how you live when your life doesn't end like a Disney movie. But there's more here than just prayer. Asaph is dealing with some really difficult questions. Verses 5 through 9 take a turn away from just the action of prayer and start wrestling with these difficult questions. Effectively, the central question is, why isn't God doing more? He begins to consider the days of old, to remember my song in the night, to meditate in my heart, to make a diligent search. So he's thinking, and it's painful because it makes him ask these difficult questions. Think if you've ever asked these questions in your life. Will the Lord spurn forever? Will He never again be favorable? Has His steadfast love ceased forever? Are His promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He in anger shut up His compassion? Notice that he is directly questioning the favor, the love, the promise, the faithfulness, and the compassion of God. Do you think Asaph really believes that God is not loving and that He's unfaithful? I don't think so, and the rest of the psalm bears out that that's not his core belief, but he does do something that's important here. Talking this way is an honest recognition that pain and suffering can often create really difficult emotions, which we know aren't even based on truth. But they can feel true nonetheless. When you're in the midst of a really hard relationship, when you feel lonely, when you feel abandoned, when you are in pain or aching at the loss of a loved one, you experience feelings that are just like Asaph, that wonder, God, where are you? Pain creates many kinds of tensions, and these honest, rhetorical questions are a vital part of lament. In fact, honest, pain-filled questions are actually at the heart of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It was Jesus Himself who said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus lamented in multiple places. These types of questions, It's important to ask them, and it is better to ask them than to not ask them. Asking the tough questions pushes us towards finding the correct positive response. Asking tough questions is good. Doubt put into plain speech is infinitely better than doubt that remains silent and is left to fester in your own heart. Any thought, good or bad, can be dealt with once it's spoken. And God can handle our tough questions. Praying through pain means that we deal honestly with the strong emotions that we feel and the difficult questions we face. So pause for a moment, zoom out from the context of Psalm 77 and ask yourself, is there anything that you personally have stopped talking to God about? Any questions that you've not asked? Maybe have you asked those questions with the wrong heart? Lament is humbly praying through the pain. It leads us to worship while also being worship. We move on in Psalm 77. At first, he starts off with this repetition of aloud. It's, I cry aloud to God, but now there's this other repetition that we see in verse 11, and it's the word remember. So we see in Psalm 77, there's both the journey of lament that's contained within this psalm, and there's the end destination. The first 9 verses here that we've just been talking about set up the tension, and then the back half resolves that tension. This psalm kind of captures this framework in a really neat and tidy way, and there's a ton of lament psalms. Not every psalm is so neat and tidy in its resolution of these things. Like the book of Lamentations, for example, kind of takes a different path, and it doesn't resolve in quite the same way. But this is where we see how biblical lamentation ends, with both the tension and the resolution, like within the larger theme of the Bible. Jesus lamented on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? But that gave way to he is risen and he is not here. Paul in Romans 8 said, I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. So we know larger pictures within the scope of Scripture talk to us about how our lament and our pain and our suffering are going to be resolved eventually. But getting there may not come quickly or easily or in a time frame that meets our expectations. So in the interim, before all of our laments are resolved and we're with the Lord forever, we need to do what Asaph does here, and we need to remember. That's what begins here in verse 10. He makes a very significant shift with the word then, and then there's this appeal afterwards to the history of God's powerful deliverance. Look at it in verse 10, the language that's connected to his remembering. I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. But then there's a reflection that shifts to an even more personal appeal. It's almost like Asaph here is talking directly to God. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your works and meditate on your mighty deeds. Asaph is looking back and he's reflecting on the works of God in Israel's past. His lament has brought him to the place where he is now remembering the numerous ways in which God has proven himself to be trustworthy. But then we see a focus that shifts again from instead like the historical works of God, now to the very character of God himself. Your way, verse 13, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? Notice how this rhetorical question is so different than the 6 previous questions that he asked. You are the God who works wonders, verse 14. You make your might known among the peoples. So Asaph's remembering is now becoming more and more focused. It's not just on the old historical deeds of God. It now has convalesced into an understanding of his character, and it's going to keep going. It gets even more specific. In verse 15, we see a hint. You have, with your arm, redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. And in verse 16 through 20, we see the final point about where he's going. This prayerful lament from Asaph finds its hope-filled resolution in the ultimate moment that defined the people of Israel and their relationship with God, the Exodus. Verse 15 talks about the redemption of the children of Jacob and Joseph, which is a clear reference to their time when they were in Egypt. But verses 16 through 20 talk about the Red Sea crossing, which was another defining moment in the life of Israel. And it uses really similar language to the Song of Moses, which is what the people sang after they witnessed this defeat of Pharaoh in real time. Let's read those verses together, 16 through 20. It's really powerful and comforting language. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. In the Exodus and in the Red Sea crossing, God's power and his care for his people are very clearly seen. But within the context of Psalm 77, do you see what Asaph is doing here? Do you see how this teaches us to lament? He anchors his questioning, hurting heart to the single greatest redemptive event in the history of Israel. He took his heart back to the foundation of everything he believed in. And as he talks about this moment, he uses words that are incredibly poignant and incredibly precious. Look at these words in verses 19 and 20. Your way was through the sea. At the crossing of the Red Sea, the sea was this giant trial. The sea was this thing that they could not see how they were possibly going to get through. And yet God's way was through the very thing they were struggling with. Yet your footprints were unseen. So God, not only did you deliver us through this really hard time, even in the moment we couldn't fully see what you were doing, you led your people like a flock. Yet even in that, when you were leading us through this dark, scary, awful, hard trial, and it was in a way that we couldn't fully understand even what we were seeing, and we knew you were there, you led your people like a flock with gentle guidance, and you were there all along. So the Exodus is an anchor for Asaph's lament. There's no greater moment up to this point in Israel's history, and so it defined his understanding of God's character and gave him hope right smack dab in the middle of this dark trial that he's going through. Even though it seemed at the beginning of this like God had forgotten his people. The Exodus was an anchor for his weary soul. Remembering began to lead him through his lament. So how does that apply to us? We now have a redemptive event that we can anchor our laments to that, no offense to the crossing of the Red Sea, blows it out of the water. The cross of Jesus, that's the place where we found deliverance. It's the place where all of our doubts and questions should be taken. It's the foundation of our hope, and it's our confidence that no matter how dark or difficult or bleak that our life may be, God has already proven himself to be for us and not against us.
Amen.
Romans 8 says, "What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who didn't spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?" So, we can lament the brokenness and the pain and the sufferings of this life while anchoring our hearts to the bedrock truth that is the grace of God. We can lament and join in the lamentations of others as they wrestle with difficult questions and emotions that are challenging. We can keep praying and keep seeking and keep wrestling. We can cry out to God in our human pain. He wants us to do it. He wouldn't have included so many references to people crying out to him if he didn't want us to do the same. And we can do so with a hope that one day God's going to make everything right. In our lament, we can still trust. This is a picture that I think a lot of you have seen. This is a picture of the Covenant School, where just a few weeks ago, that awful, senseless act of violence and sin and darkness happened, and where you could very confidently say there has been a dark cloud of pain and questions. This picture was taken on the first day back at the Covenant School. On the first day back, when they got together to worship and have a chapel service, and God put a reminder of his promises in the sky to say that even in dark, cloudy places, he has new mercies. And that's what he's done through the whole Bible, and that's what he's going to keep doing in our lives. And praise be to Jesus, and praise be to God, and praise be to the cross. This picture is a beautiful example of how we are reminded of God's promises and how we can continue to trust in the one who keeps us trusting. Let's stand and sing.